Julie, real quick, come tell us about Scott. Yeah, come on. This is going to go on BDE. It's Wednesday. What time are we doing? And what are we doing?
Okay, we're doing...
Talking to the mic. Okay.
Scott Tinker will be coming on live with Chuck and maybe Mark.
I'll be in the
room. Wednesday at 10 a.m. Central Time. He'll be answering questions live. Y'all will have a great discussion. Very excited about it.
So do we, on Collide though, we've got AMA open forum for questions. And so I'm going to kind of facilitate whatever those questions are while we're chatting.
It's more of a webinar. So y'all will have a talk, just like a podcast.
Yep.
And then, questions will come in 10 minutes.
Cool.
Last 10 minutes, y'all will do questions. And it's already up. So you can already go and ask questions if you have any you want to ask.
Yeah, if you got anything you want to ask
it.
Scott, hit it up because I will be doing my detailed research tomorrow, so I'll be prepared.
It sounds like Mark's got it. You should let him take it.
Oh, you're firing me now?
Okay. If you haven't yet seen Switch and Switch On, his feature-length documentaries from a few years ago, they are good pre-reading material, so to speak, for Wednesday. Scott's also just started a show on PBS. I'm in the midst of watching at least what appears to me to be the first episode, where he's got Ernie Moniz and Dan Yergin as his guests talking oil and geopolitics of oil, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, no, it's going to be fascinating because he is such a smart dude.
And a nice dude.
Yeah. No, he's been great. I mean, how we talked him into coming on Collide to do a webinar is it's pretty impressive. Crystal and Julie get big props for that.
So guess what?
What?
We're not going to start with oil.
Yay.
We're going to start with hurricanes.
I've been so totally wrong. Actually, you know what we're going to start with? Today, 1997, what happened?
Today, 1997, was that around the start of the Asian financial crisis?
Actually, maybe not. More importantly, Steve Earle released Telephone Road.
Awesome.
There we go. All righty. So we'll start hurricanes. I had Chris Martz on, as I like to say, the Chuck Yates Needs a Job official climatologist weatherman. And for those of you who aren't following Chris on X, he's a must follow. He's a senior in college, getting a degree in climatology, and is just amazing in terms of facts and figures. And so I had him on to talk about last week's hurricane. And I think one of the big important things that came out of it was just, if you pull up the data and you look at number of hurricanes, intensity of hurricanes over the last 100 years, there's just no correlation to CO2, i.e. climate change is not causing this, despite the rhetoric.
As evidenced by the simplest, most directly correlative metric, and that is central pressure of those storms at landfall. I mean, since 1851. And so taking that as fact, in other words, lower the pressure, the stronger the storm, you've got like a 0.009 R square of that data over a 170-year period. I thought the interesting thing with this next one, Milton, that doesn't just sound like a very fierce storm, but it actually is. It just spun up to a Category 4 just within the last couple of hours, at least. That's the headline that popped across. And I've got family in the Orlando area, and current track is just south of there. I think what it shows is that the biggest landfall impact will be around Sarasota, large surge threat in Tampa again, 10 to 12 feet.
I've got a good friend that lives in Tampa, a high school friend.
And so it's not as common as a development in the North Atlantic, in that this appears to have spun up in essentially Hurricane Alley, right around the Yucatan. Actually, I saw something, Joe Bastardi, I believe, talked about it. Sometimes his stuff is kind of hard to decipher on Twitter. But I think the origin of the storm is actually in the Pacific, and it crossed over the Mexican mainland and popped back up in Hurricane Alley. And so looking at about a Wednesday midday landfall. So once it turned to the northeast, it starts to move very quickly. So
Chris Martz pointed out, because there's been a lot of talk about, controlling the weather, if you will. But Chris pointed out that 12 hurricanes in our history have moved, in effect, west to east like this. So this is rarer, but not unprecedented to have a hurricane move that direction.
I saw something in response to the rarity point of this happening by Janice Dean, who is Fox News' chief meteorologist. She's become a lot more high profile because of the fact that both of her in-laws died in nursing homes, and she's
under the Cuomo regime.
She has been in fierce pursuit of justice with respect to that whole era. But she tweeted a map somewhat sarcastically, but humorously, that, yeah, it's exceedingly rare. And there's, just the spaghetti plot of all the historical hurricanes dating back to the 1800s that have originated in that area. Some number of those have moved west to east. I thought Chris did a good job over the weekend explaining the dynamics in terms of this more rare type of pattern and movement from west to east. But I think a couple of main points from my watch of that emergency or special podcast. One, he's absolutely right about the data. It's there. It is largely government or government-related data that is readily available. And the other point is both sides are making somewhat,
hyperbole,
if not significantly ridiculous pronouncements. I thought it was interesting, and I actually agree with him, that the Republican side could do a much better job of not deflecting and then going off on an energy policy tangent, and actually using very simple to understand multi-year data, multi-decade data to reinforce a point, which then invites, theoretically, the opposing side to bring its data to support its point, which never happens.
Yeah, the big picture point and again, thanks, Chris, for coming on the podcast and explaining all things hurricane. The big point for me is I got into an argument on LinkedIn with a high school buddy of mine who's like, you're being a climate denier. And it's so important, and, you're denying it, and Exxon knew and lied, and people are going to die. And my counter to Doug back, and Doug and I have been friends forever. My counter to Doug back is, no, when it's equally as bad to make false claims, hurricanes are getting worse because of climate change, when the data doesn't support that, because we will get policies that make energy less available, more expensive, and people die when energy prices are high or energy is not available. And I go, you can talk all you want to as an American who lives in energy abundance, but you're going to go tell the next billion people in Africa and Southeast Asia that are coming on the planet, no, you guys don't get energy because we're making up false claims that climate change is causing hurricanes. I go, that's equally as bad. And I even think that's worse than supposedly what you say Exxon did. So,
and I think it's important to do those special edition podcasts like you did with Chris, because he he himself is an admitted, he underwent a transformation and got immersed in the data out of curiosity. He was a believer in all the kind of hyperbolic things that Al Gore, et cetera, have been promoting for the last 30 or 40 years. And so he's always looking to guide people into accessing the data.
Yeah, he'll give links
looking at
all
it,
the time,
thinking about it, and then forming your own opinion.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, but the other point on the political debate is, maybe he didn't give kudos, but credit to the Democrats for staying on topic when that topic is raised. They say it with a lot of passion and conviction. Never mind the fact that there's not a lot of verifiable data to support that. In fact, there's refuting data that he routinely cites. But they stay on message and continue to kind of drive home the emotion of the point, which I think is, politically astute. So,
yeah, no, it's
but the data's there. Use it.
Yeah, no, exactly. So anyway, thoughts and prayers with our friends in Florida, because this is not going to be a good week.
Oh, by the way, I made my daughter who lives in Orlando aware that there was another storm coming on Saturday morning.
Oh, okay, well, good. Anyway, okay. So we said we weren't going to talk about oil, but we'll go to Iranian oil exports, because I thought, you sent around Josh Young's tweet this weekend, and I thought it was a really good one.
So let's take it up to a higher level first. And there's been whispers and conjecture as what is Netanyahu going to do next? And there's two dimensions to, I guess, infrastructure and energy. One is, is there a threat to Iranians' nuclear power infrastructure? And then two, the threat that Netanyahu decides to do something disruptive with respect to Iran's ability to either produce or export. And so looking at that, and quite frankly, I was a little surprised to wake up this morning and not have some massive headline, just given the fact that this is the first anniversary of the October 7th terrorist attack. And just given the rhetoric and the consistency with which Netanyahu has backed up that rhetoric, the aggressive rhetoric, he's followed through. And so on Friday, in fact, I just shared it with you, Netanyahu made a statement really strongly condemning what French President Macron had said, forget what form it was, but basically suggesting that the West ought to impose an arms embargo on Israel. And so it's a very impassioned and very sobering 2 minutes of Netanyahu really reiterating the conviction that we're going to, we'll do this with you or without you. And so kind of behind the scenes in terms of what arm twisting or negotiating is going on, the target of the response or whether there will be a response. I think you said that there's potentially something on the table.
Yeah, there have been reports of kind of rumors of a deal from the United States for no or a limited response. You never know if these things are true or if they're rumors, but I saw that. I think the interesting thing, so our buddy Mark Rosano, who was on last week, tweeted out this morning a really good point. You can go after the nuclear facilities, you can go after the oil infrastructure of Iran if you're Israel. But if the regime gets toppled, the new regime, which would be very pro-West by all accounts, the Iranian people are generally thought to be very, very pro-American. There's more plastic surgery done in Iran than anywhere else on the planet, et cetera. How would they be able to run, have a modern economy if you've gotten rid of their revenue? So it's almost the quandary of how do we starve them in the short term to get rid of the regime, but then at the same time make sure they have a base to be a successful people.
It would have to be fairly surgical, and there are a number of risks that then create problems from an international perspective. One of which is you go in and do a bunch of damage to, say, Karg Island and storage terminals or Iranian tankers or producing infrastructure that may result in really catastrophic oil spill events. That's going to be, I think, a big negative on the world stage in terms of all the environmental damage that something that like that could cause. Recall the first invasion of Kuwait,
right? And
how many oil well fires and all the kind of vast, very visible and very impactful, at least to see it firsthand. Just oil flowing everywhere, all over the ground, and the water is even worse. And so I think that aspect is one thing. If you can do things that impair, and we'll talk about this as the next part of the topic, you can do things to impair their ability to export without exposing the infrastructure to something that's going to take multiple years to rehab and get operational again. I don't know what that is. I'm not suggesting they do that. I don't know what the right answer is. I know the path that they've been on has been very surgical and very precision and very intelligence driven. So if you look at what they did to the Hezbollah leadership structure and with the pager attacks, et cetera, I think it's more about if there's a regime toppling that is the solution to Israel, or what wins the battle for Israel, it is more about taking out the leadership as opposed to exposing the Iranian population to widespread kind of economic hardship.
The crazy reporting from last week was that they embedded the stuff in the beepers 9 years ago, and they ran the beeper company profitably while they were using it to spy on Hezbollah before they turned it into the bombs that they used it for. I don't know if you saw any of that, but that's that.
I think you gave me a heads up on that.
Yeah, that's unbelievable. If true, that's
so the Iranian export as it relates to pre and post sanctions, for example. Josh Young tweeted this morning, or replied, or reposted, and you have a comparison of the destination of Iran's monthly oil exports in 2017 and then now. So, and the focus here is China. In 2017, China accounted for 26% share of Iranian oil exports. Today, they're 91%. Syria and Venezuela rounding out the majority of the remainder of that. And there was another comment by a government official in China saying, I can find that tweet. We'll post that as well. Basically saying we're not beholden to any other country. We don't recognize the political objectives. We're trying to do what's best with China, so we'll take Iranian oil, is basically what he was saying, and
right,
kind of middle fingering the rest of the coalition of countries that are ostensibly anti-Iranian and behind the sanctions. The barrels will flow. It just points out another kind of feeble actual outcome of sanctions, particularly in things as global and as, no pun, liquid as oil markets. Those barrels will find a market and will find a home.
Yeah, I mean, you could go back and look under various points of Iranian sanctions and notice a corresponding increase in Iraqi production, as they smuggled stuff across the border, or at least, reported things through the border. That being said, though, and I was called a simpleton this weekend for making this statement, but I truly believe it. The Iranian regime having money is just bad. That leads to this nefarious stuff. And the more we can do to squeeze the Iranian regime so that it does not have money to cause all this, I think we've got to be focused on, because that really is the difference looking back over the last 10 years.
I mean, you have all these gray and black market activities going on in terms of ships being transloaded en route. There's allegedly quite a bit of that going on offshore Malaysia. And ultimately the destination, those that are doing the surveillance of those kind of shadowy market operations, the ultimate destination is almost 100% China.
Yeah.
So this take from China, or take from Iran by China, makes perfect sense in that you've got, I don't know if I would characterize the Chinese as agnostic. China is doing what's best for China, like we've seen from several other countries, like, the Indians are
buying Russian oil.
Well, they're ramping up coal production and coal-fired generation, and playing that international political balancing act. So, we'll see what happens. But he has said that we are going to respond in what manner, shape, or form that takes.
There's a time and place of our choosing, I think, is the
been pretty effective so far.
Yeah. All right.
So I was going to say that right before we came in here, I looked at crude and it was fairly muted, although up a little bit. It's now up a couple of bucks and has gotten close to $77 for TI. So
it's up, what, call it 15% since I made my pronouncement that oil is fairly valued and it's going down. There we go.
Fundamentals don't matter.
Fundamentals don't matter. So speaking of oil, BP, are they backpedaling? Is this an official mea culpa, or is this?
I somewhat cynically, maybe not derisively, although I've got Exxon DNA. BP has long been suffering from a bit of an identity crisis as it relates to sustainability, and it dates all the way back to almost 25 years ago. If you remember things like advertising campaign, It's a Start, almost apologetically, yeah, we're an oil and gas company, but we're doing things in the alternative space. And then kind of the relabeling and renaming Beyond Petroleum. They've got a very, I think, environmentally friendly and attractive logo, as silly as that seems. But more recently, and we've talked about it a lot, among the U.S. and European majors peer group, in the last 5 years, they've had varying degrees of response to stakeholder demands for a pivot to alternatives or renewables, for example. Net zero, scope 3 net zero. BP was, I think, the most aggressive and progressive and pivoting hard and moving quickly. They also spent many more billions than any one of their peers committing to things like offshore wind leases in the North Sea, which they've since impaired, an exit of their U.S. wind business. They also explicitly stated very aggressively, we're going to, and that's really the focus of this particular article that came out this morning, started with, by 2030, we're going to contract our oil production by 40%. Well, that was revised when the new CEO took over after Auchinleck, after Looney was somewhat unceremoniously exited.
Yeah, that's very basically put. But
basically a tacit acknowledgement that we have got to play catch up here on kind of investor priorities, which is returns ultimately. And for all the reasons we've talked about in the renewable space, supply chain issues, inflation, et cetera, we're going back to the foreseeable future to refocus on our core business, which we've been about for 150 plus years. And so I guess it's better late than never. But if you look at relative performance of BP and Exxon over the last 5 years, which is about the start 2019, 2020, maybe 2018, but the last 5 years of relative performance of BP versus Exxon, BP's cumulative returns is minus 12% over 5 years. Exxon's return 85%.
Yeah.
So that is a bit, and you can look at any time slice over the last 3, 5, 10, 25 years, that has been the case.
So there's a retired BP engineer that I have coffee with. It feels like almost every morning down in Richmond. They're a group of folks.
Not Vlad?
Not Vlad, although Vlad knows Terry really well. Terry's actually a chaplain with the constables now. But anyway, he was an engineer stationed to various places with BP. I need to get him on the podcast to come tell the story because he talks about basically, when BP bought Arco, that was the downfall. Because you had, in effect, BP making this bet on cheap natural gas at the time. But all the Arco infrastructure had been way underfunded in terms of maintenance. And he was actually part of a group that was examining the acquisition. And they came back and said, just buy the oil and gas assets, not the infrastructure. And of course, you can't do that. You can't just pick and choose what you want to buy. So they overrode that group. But their thing was, there's so much maintenance needs to be here. This is a walking disaster. And of course, that's what we've seen out of BP, all the plants that have blown up and the environmental issues and the like. And then the second point I want to make about BP is, just a company that's kind of been a train wreck and all. That being said, I've never met an ex-BP employee that I'm not just thoroughly impressed with. We've got Jane Stricker, who was a longtime BP employee who we've worked with since she's been over at the Greater Houston Area Partnership, who's great. One of the best, the Treadstone management team that I backed at Kane a couple of times, and arguably one of the best deals I've ever done. Ex-BP folks, just impressive. This guy Terry, who I have coffee with every morning, just very impressive people for being such a brain dead company.
Well, similarly, I think all the majors, particularly the super majors, have incredibly talented people. This is testament to, or a function of, just how terrifically complex and challenging the business is. And so, how's the industry figuring it out with declining rig count and frac activity, and yet U.S. production is fairly resilient?
Yeah.
It's because of all the stuff below the waterline, whether it's better technical understanding or description of the reservoir. These are incredibly skilled and intelligent people across the board in terms of, so you've got a lot of BP friends and Shell friends and Chevron friends. It's just a function of really the strategic direction and portfolio management of the company, which I think has a lot more to do with, in BP's case, maybe in Shell's case, Total's case, the balancing act that European domiciled majors have to do in terms of social issues and stakeholder interest balancing, whereas in the U.S., we've got a pretty clear mandate in terms of our regs with respect to the primacy of the shareholder and the stakeholder group.
Right.
Now, the last 5 to 10 years has been really murky and foggy and chaotic, but I just think that you're seeing just the forces of nature in the oil and gas business and among their investors reaching a point where it ultimately is about returns as a publicly traded major oil company. It just seems that BP took a really painful, certainly not as well advised, almost an emotional path in response to the moment, making the pivots that it did and committing the billions that it did. It didn't seem all that well considered to say, we can be a competitive player in the wind business, for example. Well, how's that when you've got Chinese manufacturers that are hugely advantaged and permanently advantaged in terms of things like raw materials dominance, supply chain, et cetera. So one other sidebar to this issue that
as I like to say, though, if you want to put oil and gas companies out of business, it's pretty easy. Just don't buy the product. I don't still resent the fact that the oil and gas companies are always the target as opposed to the consumer.
And BP's had a bit more of a kind of high wire to traverse here in the U.S. post Macondo.
Yeah.
And I was reminded of a great piece by Javier Blas in Bloomberg, which we'll attach, on really the renaissance in deep water. And most of it is centered on high pressure, high temperature. So this is 400 degrees Fahrenheit. This is 20,000 PSI stacks and equipment. This is, Casquita was discovered 2006. And it was also drilled by the Deepwater Horizon, which was the rig that was destroyed in the Macondo disaster. 2 years after Macondo, BP quietly bought up to 100% of it, bought out its working interest partners in the Casquita discovery. There's 800 feet of pay. It's been sitting there waiting to be developed. You've got Anchor with Chevron that's coming online. So, BP having to come from, a slight change in direction, if not an outright pivot to renewables in this moment of the last 5 to 10 years, to going after a place that, wasn't their best moment, defined as what happened with Deepwater Horizon and Macondo. It's just a real unique conundrum for BP in terms of how it's repositioning or pivoting back to, we're going to be more about oil and gas. We're going to tell you what oil production targets are going to be sometime in February. We're just taking contraction 25% off the table. And so, can they close the performance gap? We'll see. Talking about the relative stock performance, but it's been a structural, perpetual thing for any useful period of time from an investment standpoint.
Totally. The next story you sent around, I've read the news report on it. I haven't read the actual whole study, but basically, the EIA did a report on ERCOT and power demand because of all the data centers and Bitcoin mining coming. And it's pretty staggering. I mean, I think the punchline is a lot of demand coming. How are we going to hook all this sort of stuff up? May be crazy.
Yeah, it was a feature in their regular short-term energy outlook that was out on Thursday, and it caught my eye because it was focused on ERCOT and large flexible load, which is a general description of high-performance computing, AI, and Bitcoin. And just the sheer numbers in ERCOT, which is ERCOT territory accounts for 90% of all electrical load in Texas. Some other, I'm on a different reliability council, as I've often said. But if you look at their base case, and there's three. There's a low side case, mid case, and then high side case, which in this particular kind of demand driver and what's going on in the HPC and AI space. And oh, by the way, BlackRock and Microsoft announced a $100 billion effort for power and high performance computing and AI, just I believe last Friday, $100 billion. So Texas, back to ERCOT in Texas, we're at almost 6.5 gigawatts of large flexible load demand, LFL. That'll be 2024. So looking at 2025, the base case is 9.5, which is up 60%. That's a stunning rate of growth for a grid that has, seen, I think, episodic and more frequent intermittency problems. And we are, use this word a lot today, pivoting back to trying to build more gas-fired generation in this cycle than we have in a number of years. And I think part of that is in recognition of what's coming and what the character of the demand that's coming defined as large flexible load. So 6.5 gigs this year of large flexible load demand going to 9.5 in the base case. The high growth case takes that up to 14.2 gigs.
I mean, they're building a lot of stuff outside of Dallas.
Yeah. The question is, can you deliver on-grid utility solutions? And looking at another story, I think Jeffries projected that, delivered power to an HPC or data center associated with one of these nuclear facilities, they project that cost will be like, or the price will be like $112 a megawatt hour, which is indicative of a fairly price insensitive customer, which reliability, consistency, and uptime are all absolute critical drivers of HPC business. And so how does this play out for ERCOT when there's this, I think, standoff between, okay, we've got momentum going on the nuclear side, but look at the timelines, even in the best case. Let's say we get the NRC overhaul. Let's say we get the Energy Permitting Reporting Act implemented. What are we actually talking about major grid additions in the form of baseload nuclear power? We're talking about a utility conventional scale design. Do SMRs kind of sneak in? Natural gas is still quite debated, but faster is better. Faster and reliable is better. And I'm not saying we totally don't care what it costs, but I think there's a lot of kind of rent extraction and margin opportunity for the generators who can deliver. And if you've got to be on grid, you're in ERCOT, you're fighting a lot of priorities, particularly when you get into peak demand or a crisis situation.
So this Wednesday's Chuck Yates Needs a Job is Neil Dykman, the VC. And he wasn't predicting that this is going to happen, but he walked me through that there is enough solar manufacturing capacity that literally in 2 years we could replace all the generating capacity in America with solar stuff. And, at the end of the day, I don't know the tax incentives well enough to argue with him. He claims there aren't that many tax incentives. I know I get pitch deals all the time that say, hey, we in effect get our money back on the tax incentives, and therefore any power we sell is free, we make money off of. But at the end of the day, solar everywhere. I mean, it literally is cost of goods zero. The sun shines and boom, you get it. So that all you were talking about, the reliability, price insensitivity, et cetera, though, is going to be competing in that world where you have negative power prices at various times on here. And so seeing how I still think the way this shapes out is data centers will wind up building off-grid dedicated power centers for themselves. And I still think they're choosing nukes at this point, unless we as the natty guys make a great case for, guys, we can build turbines right here and deliver you power all the time.
I'll skip what's going on with, so kind of a microcosm of some of the difficulties with the San Antonio and Bexar County utility and how ERCOT is fighting back against what the pollution regulations mean in terms of having to curtail the uptime of some of the natural gas fired plants on that system. But to the point of generating their own, essentially an off-grid solution, I just saw that XAI opened a facility in Memphis in an old Electrolux facility. I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of square feet. It may be close to 1 million, where they're housing and operating 100,000 NVIDIA GPUs.
Yeah.
That facility needs 150 million or 150 megawatts. The utility can only deliver now 50 megawatts, and they've committed to more circuit breakers and everything else you need in terms of the wiring to be able to support that. But I need the power now. And so the controversy is around the fact that XAI has cited, I think it's 8 gas-fired turbines at that facility. So those are off-grid solutions. And so I'm not sure how the state and local emissions and pollutions regulations were worked around, but there is kind of a controversy building that they're in violation, XI are in violation of those regs because of the off-grid generations, again, gas-fired. I believe I read that the exception was related to the fact that these mobile generators, and key on mobile there, are exempt from those regulations. And I think that's interpreted, at least in the letter of the regulation, was meant to be interpreted as temporary.
Right.
But I can tell you the utility in Memphis getting its act together to fill that 100 megawatt gap that is being filled by those, 8's the right number, it sounds right, gas turbines, is, that's a lot of time to get all that done. And in a city whose budget deficit is currently approaching $900 million, which has a lot of other infrastructure needs.
But yeah,
I've just had the fortunate coincidence
of economic decline. One of the traditional
everything's
Midwest.
Understaffed. The roads are in pretty poor shape. Just general public infrastructure and the capacity to do that. And of course, the tried and true, or the tired old political resolution is we're going to cut budgets and raise taxes.
Yeah.
I think the way this plays out, and I think, we'll see the Elon scenario, because you can get gas-fired turbines in, some of these big ones in within a matter of weeks to get operational.
I think the Weasley, I don't want to say Weasley, that's the wrong word, but that's the connotation. The way you do it is, so long as they're mounted to be moved, they're considered mobile. I mean, I think that's the, I think that's the game you play so that you qualify per the letter of the law on this for the exceptions.
Yeah.
So it's going to be interesting watching that.
And as with nuclear, we're going to see political opposition and activist opposition slowly, maybe in this case quickly, worn down. And thinking that, look, this facility was a former Electrolux appliance manufacturing or assembly facility right there on the Mississippi River. we all know, and I wish Colin was here, that the difference between, this power load coming on the grid, particularly in a metropolitan or municipal area, you have a former operation at that Electrolux site that had much higher employment. We just don't have that aspect of something to offer to the community.
For the political calculus.
Right, for the political calculus. But there has to be something that is added to that to make up for the fact that you're not bringing hundreds or thousands of jobs, because these are just inherently not labor-intensive operations.
You're making a billionaire.
But there's a lot, and I think about it in the case of Memphis, there's a lot that can be done through private sector partnership on things like infrastructure and schools and just the general well-being, particularly for a city that's facing, an almost $1 billion budget deficit.
Two other big things, dynamics to just put on the table while we're talking about this, because they're going to come into play, is number one, when I had Zane Ball on Chuck Job, and he's head AI for Intel, he said it's not lost on them that they can bifurcate jobs between interruptible and non-interruptible power. So meaning the AI embedded in an emergency room monitoring stuff is going to need reliable power. Training a language model, you can kind of cycle out and cycle back in on that. So we're going to see that bifurcation as people go in and start choosing sites. The other thing to be thinking about in terms of kind of in addition to the bifurcation of this is our own Jake Corley, or former own Jake Corley, actually tweeted out, and I think it's the right thing. There used to be a huge demand for kind of this clean power. It's going to be interesting to see if that dissipates going forward. And he said it's going to dissipate going forward. And then the third thing, I said 2, but I meant 3. Right now, data centers and AI stuff have to be near fiber just because of the speed. And Starlink is getting fast. I don't know.
It's not fiber fast.
It's not fiber fast, but it's getting fast enough to fit into that whole thing of, do we really need, when we're training the language model, do we really have to have it that fast? Yes. In the emergency room, we have to have it that fast. And so those are going to be other things that come to play in this.
Yeah, it's
because you can, Elon just put Starlink into all the United flights, and Jake was on a JSX flight and actually did a FaceTime call. So that's how fast Starlink is today.
The United States is going to overcomplicate this, particularly as it relates to the potential of natural gas. We've already seen it in the form of the LNG pause, whereas other countries have raced to embrace the whole data center siting where there's a ton of gas.
Yeah.
Qatar, Saudis are leaning that way. I think Malaysia's got
they were talking
a tremendous
about
amount of momentum on that front as well.
Darwin in the Northern Territory in Australia was talking about it. If the Beetaloo Basin plays out like Brian Sheffield thinks it is, they were very cognizant of we're going to have data centers everywhere.
Well, for us in the U.S., it's these looming hurdles that thermal generation facilities may have to overcome in the form of kind of net zero. So sequestration, I don't know what other scrubbing that is going to be required for NOx and SOx and things like that. But that type of capital retrofit or upgrade for very old coal facilities in Texas basically takes 12 gigawatts out of the baseload equation immediately, because it under no circumstances it makes sense. So that's the that's kind of the ominous cloud that's building here in terms of our ability to fill the gap between the solution that ultimately has the largest scale, cleanest, and best solution, that's nuclear. But you tell me, when's 3 Mile Island going to be operational after all the demothballing and the upgrading and the retrofitting work that needs to be done? Is that 5 years?
I thought
that's
they
one.
Say 2028.
Yeah, that's one.
Yeah, that's a rehab.
But how many
should be?
I saw
easier.
I don't know if you saw the Dave Chappelle meme with he's got the powder.
You got any more of those? Got any more of those?
Got any more of those mothballed nuclear facilities?
Yeah.
So I think we are disadvantaging natural gas at a critical time, and we're seeing the response by the rest of the world that isn't encumbered by this, because the market's going to be there. It's just a question of whether those things get located in the U.S. where there's gigantic natural gas potential.
I mean, just think of the national security ramifications of not having all those assets in the United States.
Right.
I mean, yeah, it boggles the mind why we would want to lag on this. But
I said, I think around the time of the energy draft, that the leverage of natural gas is obvious. It could be both a strategic offensive or defensive weapon.
Yeah.
Just given the abundance that and the endowment that we have and the know-how and the responsibility with which we produce and use natural gas. But there's the minutia of the politics related to primarily emissions.
And the coolest thing is this could be a Texas led endeavor, because we have ERCOT, that's not regulated by the feds, because we can operate in and around there with less interference from the feds than other places. But we'll see.
Yeah. Last thing.
Yep.
We do have an on-scene report from our intrepid co-host, Mr. Coburn.
Yeah.
From Nantucket.
This is awesome. I'm digging the hat too.
The ongoing broken wind turbine blade saga that Nantucketers are. Is it Nantucketers?
Nantucketers. God, there's so many jokes going around in my head right now, but I won't say any of it. I'll be on my best behavior.
Thank you.
Yes.
So he's reporting from a recreational site, I believe, but you can see the aesthetics in Nantucket, but there's still stuff going on with respect to that turbine blade failure from a few months ago,
so
which really severely restricted his surfing season.
Well, you know what? I think this actually qualifies as a finger of the week.
Hey guys, this is Kirk reporting on the Nantucket wind farm. Recently, debris from wind turbines, specifically broken blades, has been washing up on the shores of Nantucket, still creating a serious concern for residents and environmentalists alike. The visual impact of the wind turbines is already causing a decline in property values, as the once pristine views of the ocean are now dominated by industrial structures. Hopefully you can see behind me. I've spoken with numerous locals, and there's a growing sense of frustration. Many feel that concerns have been ignored and the anger is only building. Even more windmills are scheduled to go up in the near future. So stay tuned. We'll report another one later. Cheers.